The crowded street buzzed with excitement as tourists and locals alike gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. The cool wind whispered through the towering trees surrounding the palace gates. People stood in neat rows, cameras ready, their voices a low hum of chatter. The royal guard stood in perfect formation, motionless, their uniforms immaculate. Their faces were expressions of stoic discipline, faces that had seen the world's greatest wonders and its darkest realities. At the center of the scene stood one man, different from the rest. The royal guard. His tall, powerful frame was a sight to behold, even in the face of the daily routine that had long since become a part of him. His eyes were sharp, alert, scanning the crowd, sensing every movement. Nothing escaped his attention. Nothing ever did. He had been through countless ceremonies. He had stood for hours without flinching, without moving. It was his job. His duty. But on this day, something was different. Something he couldn't predict was about to change everything. A man, dressed in casual clothes, was moving through the crowd. He looked out of place, his disheveled appearance clashing with the neatness of the ceremony. He was intoxicated, stumbling slightly as he made his way to the front. His face was flushed, eyes narrowed in some kind of irritated challenge. The people around him moved away, sensing trouble. They knew better than to get too close to a man with that kind of aura. The royal guard shifted his weight ever so slightly, but he didn't look directly at the man. That was against the rules. They were not supposed to acknowledge anything outside their posts. But the man's movements didn't go unnoticed. His approach was unmistakable. The crowd hushed when the man reached the front, only a few feet from the guard. The royal guard's breath remained steady, his gaze forward. The man stared at him with a twisted grin on his face. Then, without warning, the man spat, a forceful, deliberate spray of saliva that landed directly on the guard's face. The crowd gasped. In that brief, surreal moment, time seemed to stop. The spit hung in the air, an ugly insult frozen for everyone to witness. The guard's face twitched. It was almost imperceptible. His eyes flickered, and his chest rose and fell with a deep breath. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. The man who had spat on him stood there, a smug look plastered across his face. He had expected a reaction, an explosion of anger, a furious response. But the guard didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stood frozen, the spit now staining his uniform, an emblem of humiliation. For a split second, the crowd wasn't sure what would happen next. Would the guard lash out? Would he call for reinforcements? Would the ceremony break down into chaos? But then, something unexpected happened. The royal guard turned his head, not toward the man who had insulted him, but toward the palace gates. His eyes shifted, looking through the crowd with a calmness that seemed almost surreal. He seemed to be searching for something. The man who had spit on him, oblivious to the change, took a step back, smirking as though he had won. A few murmurs spread through the crowd, their whispers a mix of curiosity and disbelief. What was going on? Why wasn't the guard reacting? Was this some sort of game? A lesson? Or had the man's actions truly gone unnoticed? But it wasn't unnoticed. Far from it. The guard moved, slowly but deliberately, stepping toward the edge of the ceremonial area. His boots made no sound on the cobblestones as he approached the inner gates of the palace. The crowd held its breath, watching, waiting for him to make his next move. And then, as he reached the gates, he did something that stunned everyone. Without turning around, the guard raised his hand, almost as if to signal someone. It was subtle, but unmistakable. His fingers lingered for just a moment. Then, he lowered them. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. No one had seen a royal guard behave this way before. The man who had spat on him continued to stand there, clearly waiting for some sort of escalation. He was convinced that this was where the show would end. He had humiliated the guard. He had one. But the guard didn't engage. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he calmly walked toward a small door that led into the heart of the palace grounds. There was no turning back now. His movements were methodical, each step calculated, each motion deliberate. It was as if he was preparing for something far greater than any confrontation with a drunken man. The crowd exchanged confused glances. What was going on? Was the guard going to leave the scene entirely? Would the ceremony end in disgrace? No one had ever seen anything like this. Minutes passed. It felt like hours. People continued to murmur, but there was no sign of the guard. The man who had spat, meanwhile, stood there proudly. He believed this moment had marked his victory. He turned to walk away, no longer paying attention to the ceremony. He was sure he had won. But what he didn't realize was that the day had only just begun. The crowd had begun to disperse, murmuring among themselves, still uncertain about what had just happened. The royal guard was nowhere to be seen, and the drunken man who had spat on him continued to swagger away, clearly oblivious to the gravity of what he had done. His smirk had faded somewhat, replaced with a quiet satisfaction as he blended into the mass of people, confident that the guard's silence meant victory. But he hadn't counted on the chain of events that had already begun to unfold. Inside the palace grounds, behind the tall, ornate gates, the royal guard's movements had taken a new turn. What appeared to be a simple, insignificant moment, a spit in the face of authority, was the spark that had ignited something much bigger. The guard had not simply walked away to avoid confrontation, he had taken deliberate steps that no one could have predicted. The palace corridors were silent, the only sound the soft echo of his boots against the cold stone floor. The royal guard, whose name no one knew yet, moved quickly through the narrow passageways. His expression was unreadable, his thoughts focused on something far beyond the crowd or the incident that had just transpired. He was preparing for something. Inside the palace, everything had been meticulously planned. He had known this moment would come. He had been anticipating it for months, even years. And now, at long last, the time had arrived. Outside, the confusion continued. The tourists had taken out their phones, uploading pictures and videos of the now infamous moment. The streets were alive with speculation. Had the guard lost his composure? Had he given in to the taunts of an unruly visitor? What had happened to the dignity of the royal guard? Was this the end of the guard's reputation? But only a handful of people truly understood what had just transpired. A small group of highly placed palace officials knew exactly what was happening. And they were already moving behind the scenes to address the situation, though none would say a word to the public. The guard had known what he was doing. Back at the gates, the drunken man, still unaware of the guard's actions, wandered down the street in a haze. He'd won in his mind. What had seemed like a victory, however, was anything but. The royal guard's silence wasn't weakness, it was the calm before the storm. For the first time, the man's confidence wavered as the sound of sirens reached his ears. He looked around, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right. But he shook it off. What could possibly happen now? He had humiliated the guard, and no one seemed to care. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the royal guard stood in front of an enormous wooden door. He paused, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed it open, entering a room that few had ever seen. It was a private chamber, tucked away in the deepest part of the palace. Only those who had earned the highest ranks in the kingdom were ever allowed here. This was not a room for the public eye. As he stepped in, a voice called out, breaking the silence. "Is it time?" the voice asked. The guard nodded. His eyes locked onto the figure in front of him, the one who had been waiting for him. The man who had given him the task he had now set in motion. "Yes," the guard replied in a steady voice. "It's time." The figure, an older man with a commanding presence, stood up from behind a large wooden desk. His eyes were sharp, his every movement deliberate and calculated. He had known this day would come, just as the guard had. They had both prepared for this moment in silence, never letting on to anyone that something bigger was about to happen. "You did well," the man said, his tone measured. "Now, we must act quickly. There's no turning back from this." The royal guard remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had known the stakes of this mission, and he had accepted them long ago. The humiliation of the spit had been merely the catalyst. But now, everything had changed. The man before him wasn't just an official, he was part of something far greater, something that transcended the royal family and the monarchy itself. "This is bigger than what anyone can understand," the older man continued. "What you've done today, what we've all done, will change everything. We've waited for the right moment, and it's arrived." The guard nodded again, a single emotion flickering across his face: determination. There would be no turning back now. His mission had always been clear. He had been selected for this task not because he was the strongest, not because he was the most capable. No, he had been chosen because of his silence, his ability to remain unnoticed, to blend into the background until the moment was right. The spit, the insult, it had been a trigger. And now, it was time to act. Outside, the crowd had begun to notice something strange. The atmosphere had shifted, the air thick with tension. Sirens had been heard faintly, but they were growing louder. Something was happening, and the people could feel it. There was a sense of dread in the air. The drunk man who had spit on the royal guard was starting to feel uneasy. The sirens were too close now, and they weren't stopping. He turned around, glancing over his shoulder as the first patrol car screeched to a halt near the gates. The officers inside quickly got out, their expressions serious, their movements swift. They began to push through the crowd, their eyes scanning for something, someone. The man's stomach twisted. He had seen the uniforms. The police weren't here for a simple disturbance, they were here for something bigger. And they weren't about to let him slip away unnoticed. Before he could react, another car pulled up, a sleek, black vehicle that seemed to glide across the street without making a sound. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their faces unreadable. The crowd parted automatically. The tension was palpable. Whatever was happening was about to escalate. The drunken man began to back away slowly. He turned on his heel and started walking briskly, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get out of here. Fast. He didn't know why, but something told him this wasn't going to end well for him. Back inside the palace, the guard stood with the older man, awaiting their next orders. The air was thick with anticipation. The events that had been set in motion could not be undone. "Are we ready?" the older man asked, his voice low but urgent. "We are," the guard replied. The older man looked at him for a moment. His face serious. "You know what's at stake here. You know what will happen if this goes wrong." "I understand," the guard said. And with that, they turned toward the door, prepared to step into the unknown. The royal guard had always followed orders. But this time, the mission would be unlike any he had ever undertaken. What lay ahead was far more than a simple test of loyalty. This was about the very foundation of the monarchy, and he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure its survival. The streets outside the palace were alive with the buzz of activity. The crowd, still unaware of the full scope of what was happening, continued to move about, their attention divided between the grand spectacle they'd come to witness and the growing sense that something was amiss. The royal guard's absence had raised eyebrows. The once pristine ceremony had descended into an awkward silence, leaving the tourists and onlookers murmuring among themselves. But it wasn't the crowd that mattered now. It was him, the man who had spat on the guard's face. And, as he walked through the streets, his gut told him that something wasn't right. The sirens had grown louder. His unease had started as a slight discomfort but was now a gnawing feeling deep within his stomach. He couldn't shake the sense that his life had just taken a turn that he couldn't control. He had been so sure of himself. So confident. But now, with every step, he could feel the weight of something unknown, something ominous, hanging over him. Inside the palace, the royal guard, now clad in a different uniform, walked briskly down the narrow stone hallways, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. His mind raced, each thought sharp and focused. He had taken on a role that most would never understand. He had been trained for years, not just as a protector of the monarchy, but as something much more dangerous. The spit on his face was nothing but a trigger, an ignition point for the chain of events that had already begun. The older man, who had guided him through this mission, walked alongside him, his face grim but resolute. They were heading toward a part of the palace that few had ever seen, a place reserved for the highest echelon of the royal family, a place where secrets had been kept for centuries. The older man's hand rested lightly on a door handle, and with a deliberate motion, he pushed it open. The room they entered was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from an overhead chandelier, casting long shadows along the walls. "This is it," the older man said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where everything begins." The royal guard's eyes flickered toward the center of the room. At the far end, a large wooden table was covered with maps, papers, and various objects that seemed to hold little significance to anyone who wasn't involved in this clandestine world. On the far wall, a tapestry hung, its intricate design hiding the secrets that lay within the room. The older man walked toward the table, running his fingers over the surface as if expecting to find something new. "Everything you've seen up until now, the spit, the guard's silence, it was never about the moment. It was always about what happens next." The royal guard stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of the older man's words. His role had been to be unseen, to fade into the background until the right moment came. And that moment had arrived. But there was more to this than anyone had told him. "What exactly is this?" the royal guard asked, his voice barely audible. The older man glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "This, my friend, is where everything comes together. The monarchy is in danger. The kingdom is in chaos. And what happened today, outside those gates, was merely the first piece of the puzzle. We've been waiting for a reason to act." "That spit?" "It was that reason." The royal guard frowned. "What do you mean? What is going on?" The older man's face grew more serious. "You've been a part of something much bigger than you realize. There are those within the monarchy who would see it fall. There are those who want to erase the legacy of this family and replace it with something else. Something darker." Meanwhile, the drunken man who had spat on the guard was still walking, his thoughts clouded by the fog of alcohol. The sirens grew louder, and his unease only deepened. He had no idea why the police had arrived in such force. The heavy footsteps of officers echoed behind him, but when he turned, they were gone. The streets, once filled with movement, were now eerily quiet. For a moment, he felt like he was the only person left in the world, the sounds of the city muffled by his growing panic. He glanced behind him, eyes darting to catch any sign of the uniformed officers. Nothing. But there was something else, a shadow moving toward him from the alley across the street. The figure was tall, wearing a dark coat, and moved with purpose. It was not the type of person you'd want to run into on a deserted street. The man's breath quickened, his steps slowing as the figure approached. He tried to steady himself, shaking his head to clear the haze of alcohol. Was he imagining things? But no, the figure was still there. Closing in. It was only then that he realized that the figure was not just walking, it was stalking him. His heart began to pound in his chest as the figure stopped directly in front of him. The man staggered backward, his mind racing with a dozen thoughts, none of them good. Who was this person? What did they want? "You're the one, aren't you?" the shadowed figure spoke, his voice low and steady. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The man's eyes widened. He tried to back away but found his legs frozen in place. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. The figure replied, stepping forward. The royal guard. The spit. You humiliated him. Now it's your turn. Back in the palace, the royal guard had reached the table. The older man handed him a stack of documents, each one sealed and marked with a red emblem. The kingdom is on the brink of collapse. There are factions within our own family who have sold out to foreign powers. They want to take the throne for themselves. You've seen it in their eyes, the ambition, the greed. And today, that man's actions were the final straw. The monarchy cannot survive this kind of weakness. We have to act now. The royal family must be protected. The royal guard nodded, his mind racing. His silence had not just been a passive choice, it had been a test. The spit wasn't just an insult, it was a symbol. The monarchy had been under threat for years, but now it was about to face the greatest challenge in its history. Everything we've worked for has led to this moment, the older man said. The time has come for the true power to reveal itself. We've been in the shadows for too long. The royal guard turned toward the door, feeling the weight of the task that lay ahead. What do you need me to do? You're the one who has been chosen. You've been trained for this moment. You've seen the signs. Now, you must do what must be done. The drunken man was beginning to lose all sense of time. The world around him had turned into a blur. He didn't know how much longer he had been walking, but he could feel the figure behind him. The figure who had been watching him. Every step he took seemed to echo in the streets, a loud reminder that there was no escape. Then, the figure spoke again. I'm not going to hurt you, yet, the man said. But you need to understand that there is more at play here than just a momentary insult. Your actions today have set off a chain reaction. And you, my friend, are at the center of it. The drunken man's eyes widened. What had he gotten himself into? And why hadn't he seen it coming? The city's towering spires and intricate streets faded into the background as the figure in the shadows continued his pursuit. The drunken man's heart hammered in his chest as he stumbled through the darkened alleyways. His mind, clouded by alcohol, couldn't quite comprehend the danger he was in. Every step he took seemed to echo louder, filling the empty streets with a sense of impending doom. But it wasn't just the darkness that weighed on him. It was the chill in the air, the sense that something far greater was unfolding around him, and he was stuck in the middle of it. It was as if the world itself was watching him, holding its breath for what would come next. The figure's steps, deliberate and slow, matched his own erratic movements. And just as the man thought he might escape, a firm hand grasped his shoulder. He froze. The hand wasn't gentle. It was firm, demanding, unyielding. His breath caught in his throat. As he spun around, meeting the cold, calculating gaze of the figure. The figure was tall, wearing a long, dark coat. His face remained hidden under the brim of a wide, black hat, but the shadowy figure's presence sent a wave of dread crashing over the man. You can't run from this, the figure said, his voice deep and gravelly, filled with the weight of someone who had seen too much, who knew too much. You started something you don't understand. But now it's too late to turn back. The drunken man's legs buckled beneath him, a wave of panic overwhelming his senses. What are you talking about? He croaked, his voice trembling. I didn't mean, I wasn't thinking. The figure leaned in, the smell of leather and smoke thick in the air. You've ignited something. You've caught the attention of people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. The monarchy, the guard, the family, they're not just defending the throne anymore. They're defending their legacy. And you just gave them a reason to fight back. A cold chill ran down the man's spine. This wasn't just about a casual insult anymore. He had stepped into a much darker world, a world where his actions had consequences he couldn't fathom. The figure's eyes seemed to pierce through him, reading his very thoughts. He had no idea how to escape this nightmare. "What do you want from me?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Not much. Just your cooperation. You'll do what we say, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive what's coming." Meanwhile, the royal guard stood in the dimly lit room inside the palace. The weight of the documents on the table seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. His mind swirled with questions, each one more pressing than the last. What had he truly become a part of? What had his actions set in motion? He had joined this mission under the assumption that he was serving his country, but now he was beginning to realize just how far-reaching and dangerous it truly was. The older man beside him spoke again, his voice calm but filled with an unsettling authority. "This isn't just about one man or one incident. This is a battle for the throne itself. There are those within the royal family who are planning to overthrow the monarchy. They have allies, powerful allies, who want to see the kingdom brought to its knees. And they will stop at nothing to achieve their goals." The royal guard clenched his fists, trying to control the wave of emotions flooding through him. He had been trained to remain calm, to stay focused, but this was a different level of danger. He had no idea that his entire existence had been leading to this moment, this mission. The spit on his face, the humiliation, it was all part of a much larger picture, a game of power and manipulation that had been unfolding behind the scenes for years. "They want to destroy everything." The older man continued, his voice now colder. "And they'll use any means necessary to do it. The guard you met earlier, he's just the tip of the iceberg. You'll see more of this. More incidents like that one. But it's not about revenge. It's about control." The royal guard swallowed hard, trying to digest the gravity of the situation. "How do you know all this?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The older man looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "I've been in the shadows for years, watching, listening. I've seen the cracks form in this kingdom, and I've been waiting for someone to rise up. But now that you're involved, there's no turning back." The tension in the air outside the palace was palpable. The crowd had grown restless, the police presence now a looming, silent reminder of the chaos that had erupted earlier. The royal guard, now fully aware of the depths of the conspiracy, paced back and forth in the dimly lit hallway. He couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched, that every decision he made would push the kingdom closer to the edge of destruction. But just as he began to settle his thoughts, a loud knock on the door broke his concentration. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The older man glanced at him, motioning for him to remain still. Slowly, he walked to the door and opened it a crack. A familiar face appeared in the doorway, pale and grim. "The man, he's gone," the messenger whispered urgently. "He's disappeared. We lost track of him after the incident. It's as if he vanished into thin air." The royal guard's blood ran cold. The man who had spat on him, the one who had triggered everything, had disappeared without a trace. His eyes darted back to the table, where the documents lay waiting. It was clear now. This wasn't a random act of disrespect. It was a calculated move. The man had been a pawn in a much larger game, and now that he was out of the picture, the stakes had just gotten higher. "Find him," the royal guard ordered, his voice low but filled with urgency. "We can't let him slip away. He's too important." The figure who had been following the drunken man now stood at the edge of the alley, his back turned, as if waiting for something. The man was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't matter. He had done what was necessary. He had made his presence known. And soon, the pieces would fall into place. The figure's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, his face hardening. A message had arrived. It was from the same people who had orchestrated everything up to this point. The game had changed. The royal family was onto them, and they needed to act quickly. He glanced one last time at the empty alleyway before disappearing into the shadows, blending seamlessly with the darkness. There was no time to waste. The mission was far from over. The air inside the palace was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the walls, refusing to let go. The royal guard's mind raced as he paced back and forth in his private chambers. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. Every moment felt like the ticking of a bomb, the seconds ticking by with ruthless inevitability. His every move was scrutinized. The world outside the palace was waiting, ready to explode. He glanced at the window. The city sprawled out beneath him, the lights twinkling like stars in a dark sky. But there was something off about the scene. It felt too quiet. Too still. The tension in the air wasn't just confined to the palace, it had seeped into the streets, into every corner of the kingdom. The echoes of unrest reverberated through the hearts of the people. They knew something was coming, but they didn't know what. In the corner of the room, a small phone buzzed against the table, its screen lighting up. It was a message from the older man, the one who had been guiding him through this entire nightmare. The message was short but loaded with urgency. They've made their move. You need to act fast. We can't wait any longer. The royal guard's heart skipped a beat. They had made their move. The pieces were falling into place, and he could feel it in his bones. Everything he had been trained for, everything he had believed in, was about to be tested in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. He grabbed the phone, his fingers trembling as he typed a quick response. Where do I go? What do I do next? The phone buzzed again, this time with a location and a time. A warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Midnight. It was a place that held secrets, secrets that had been buried for years, waiting to be unearthed. The royal guard didn't hesitate. He had no choice but to follow the trail. The time for hesitation had passed. He was already in too deep. At the same time, the streets of the city were far from quiet. In the shadows of the alleyways and hidden corners, a different kind of movement was taking place. The figure, the one who had been following the drunken man, now stood in the heart of the city. He had been watching, waiting. His mission was clear, and yet, there was something gnawing at him, something he couldn't quite shake. The disappearance of the man who had spit on the royal guard had created a ripple effect. The events of the past few days had set a chain of reactions into motion, and now everything was at a breaking point. The figure had expected things to play out differently, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The disappearance of the man was only the beginning. He moved with purpose through the alley, blending into the shadows as if he were one with the darkness itself. His every step was calculated, measured. His target was close, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake. The royal guard was already on his trail, and he knew it. The game had changed, and the stakes had been raised. He wasn't just up against the royal guard now, he was up against the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the king sat in his private study, his face drawn with concern. The royal advisors had been whispering for days now about the growing unrest among the people. They spoke of a conspiracy, of a threat from within. But the king had dismissed it as mere paranoia, the ramblings of those who were too eager to see enemies where none existed. But now, as he sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him with crushing force. His mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the sense of dread that had taken root in his heart. The whispers of the conspiracy were no longer so easily dismissed. They had become a reality. The kingdom was on the brink of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The king's hands clenched into fists, the tension in his body palpable. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The time for action was now. But what action? Who could he trust? The royal guard, his most loyal soldier, had been caught in the web of lies and deceit, and now the king was forced to wonder whether he, too, had been a pawn in a much larger game. The phone on the king's desk buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his fingers shaking slightly. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of the world. They know. They're coming for you. The king's blood ran cold. It was happening. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was crumbling before his eyes. There was no turning back now. But who was they? Who was behind this web of deceit? The answers seemed just beyond his reach, slipping through his fingers like sand. At the warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the clock ticked toward midnight. The royal guard arrived, his mind sharp with anticipation, his senses heightened. The location was remote, tucked away from the prying eyes of the public. The shadows seemed deeper here, more oppressive. The air smelled of damp earth and rust. The warehouse loomed in front of him, its silhouette a dark outline against the night sky. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The room was dimly lit, the flickering light from a single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. In the center of the room stood a table, cluttered with old papers, maps, and files. The older man was already there, waiting for him. "You came," the older man said, his voice low, but tinged with urgency. "Good. We don't have much time." The royal guard nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "What's going on? What do you need from me?" The older man gestured to the papers on the table. "This," he said, "is the key. These documents reveal everything, the conspiracy, the players involved, and the lengths they've gone to stay hidden. They think they've covered their tracks, but they've made one mistake. They underestimated us." The royal guard stepped closer to the table. His heart pounding in his chest as he scanned the papers. The documents were filled with names, dates, and locations, names he recognized, and names he didn't. The conspiracy was far-reaching, far more complex than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the throne. It was about power, control, and manipulation on a scale he had never seen before. "I need you to take this," the older man said, sliding a small envelope toward him. "Deliver it to the one person who can stop this. She's the key." The royal guard hesitated for a moment, his fingers lingering on the envelope. "Who is she?" The older man's eyes darkened. "She's someone who's been fighting this battle for years. And she's been waiting for someone like you. Don't waste time. They're already making their move." As the royal guard took the envelope, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. Every instinct told him to be careful, but his duty was clear. The pieces were all falling into place, but he had no idea what awaited him on the other side. The clock struck midnight. And in the shadows of the city, a storm was brewing, one that would change everything. The storm had come. Not a literal one, though the winds had picked up, and the sky was dark, threatening rain, but the storm inside the royal guard's mind was a tempest unlike anything he had ever experienced. The envelope, now clutched tightly in his hand, felt like the weight of an entire kingdom pressing down on him. Every step he took felt heavier. Every breath he took was labored. He was walking on the edge, teetering between duty and betrayal, between right and wrong. He stood before the door, the small office lit only by a flickering lamp. Inside, a figure awaited. A woman. The key to everything. He had heard her name whispered in the shadows, a name that carried with it the weight of history and rebellion. But who was she, really? What role had she played in all of this? And, more importantly, could he trust her? His hand hovered over the door's handle. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed distant, as though the entire world was holding its breath. The answers he sought, answers that had eluded him for so long, lay just beyond that door. But there was one thing he couldn't shake. The feeling that everything he had learned so far was just the beginning of an even greater truth. And that truth was about to change everything. Inside, the woman stood with her back to him, staring out the small window. She was tall, her silhouette sharp against the dim light. Her hair, long and dark, fell in loose waves down her back. She was dressed simply, but there was an undeniable air of authority about her. A quiet power that radiated from her every movement. "Are you going to stand there all night?" she asked, her voice cool but not unfriendly. "Or are you going to come in?" The royal guard hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. His eyes locked onto her immediately, but he said nothing. Words, at that moment, felt useless. He knew why he was here. He knew what he had to do. But could he trust her? Could he trust anyone anymore? She turned to face him, her eyes dark, but not unfriendly. "You brought the envelope," she said, her gaze flicking down to the small package in his hand. "Good. Let's get to the point. You've been following the trail, just like I thought you would." The royal guard stepped forward, the envelope still clutched in his hand. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What's really going on here?" The woman's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm someone who has been fighting for a long time. For the kingdom. For the people. And for something much bigger than what you've been led to believe." She paused for a moment, as if considering her next words carefully. "You've been fed lies, soldier. Lies that kept you from seeing the truth. Lies that made you believe you were fighting for the right side." He stared at her, his mind racing. "Lies? But I've been fighting for the monarchy, for the kingdom. I've given everything. I've sacrificed everything. And for what?" "For nothing," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You've been a pawn, just like the rest of us. A pawn in a game that's been played for centuries. A game of power, control, and manipulation. And now, we're at the breaking point. But the good news is, you have a choice." The royal guard's heart began to race. "A choice," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" The woman stepped forward, her gaze intense. "You've already been part of the revolution, whether you realize it or not. Every move you've made, every decision you've made, has brought us closer to this moment. And now, you can either keep playing the game and stay loyal to the crown, or you can help us end it all." She reached out and took the envelope from his hand. "This," she said, "contains the proof. The proof that the monarchy has been controlling everything. The truth about the royal family, about the conspiracies, about the plans to maintain power. You can't undo what's been done, but you can expose it. You can show the world the truth." For a moment, the royal guard stood frozen, his mind spinning. The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of her words settled over him. Everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in, was falling apart. What if she was right? What if everything he had been taught, everything he had sacrificed for, was a lie? "I don't know who to trust anymore," he muttered, his voice cracking. "How can I believe you? You could be just another part of the system, another pawn in a different game." The woman's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to see the truth. And once you see it, you'll have to make a choice. A choice that will change everything." In that moment, the world outside seemed to vanish. The noise of the city, the distant hum of life, all faded into the background. All that existed was the royal guard and the woman before him, and the envelope that held the key to everything. His heart pounded in his chest as the truth started to sink in. He had been fighting for a cause he thought was just. But now he knew better. There were no clear lines. No heroes or villains. Only shades of gray. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why am I the one you chose?" The woman met his gaze steadily. "Because you're the only one who can change things. You've been inside the system. You know how it works. You can expose the corruption, and you can take them down. But you have to decide if you're ready to bear the consequences. He swallowed hard. The weight of his decision loomed over him. If he exposed the truth, the kingdom would never be the same. The monarchy would crumble, the royal family would fall, and the people would rise. But was he willing to pay the price? Could he bear the consequences of exposing the truth? You don't have to do it alone, she said, her voice quiet but firm. There are others. Others who are ready to fight. And if you expose the truth, we'll have a chance to rebuild. A chance to create something better. But it all starts with you. For a long moment, the royal guard stood there, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy burden. The truth was within his grasp, and with it, the power to change everything. But was he ready to face the consequences? Was he ready to tear down everything he had ever known? Finally, he nodded. All right. I'll do it. I'll expose the truth. The woman smiled faintly. Good. You've made the right choice. As the royal guard left the room, the envelope burning a hole in his pocket, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The kingdom, the monarchy, the people, it was all about to change. And there was no going back. The storm that had been building for so long was about to break. But in the end, it wasn't just the monarchy that would fall. It was the lies, the corruption, the system that had held everything in place. And as the royal guard took his first step toward exposing the truth, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. We're left with a deeper question: how often do we find ourselves fighting for causes we believe in, only to discover the truth is far more complicated than we ever imagined? The royal guard's journey isn't just about exposing a corrupt monarchy. It's about discovering the power within oneself to make a difficult choice, to confront the truth, and to change the course of history. It's about recognizing that sometimes, the fight for justice begins with the willingness to face the uncomfortable reality and choose a side, knowing that the consequences, though heavy, will be worth the fight for what is right.